I'm Tony Sirna, and I live at Dancing Rabbit Eco Village, and I'm 36 years old, and I've lived here for almost 13 years now. Dancing Rabbit got started in 1993, and there was a group of us living in a student co-op at Stanford called Synergy. And so we were already living in community and had an experience of making decisions by consensus and living cooperatively. And we wanted to do something that would change the world. And we specifically were focused on ecological living. And someone got the idea that the way to do that was to create a full-scale village focused on sustainable living, and to be a demonstration project in that way, because we felt like anything smaller than that wouldn't really be full-featured, and anything, we didn't really have plans for something larger than that. That seemed ambitious enough. And it was interesting because we weren't using the term eco-village at the time. It wasn't really in the common usage, and yet other people were coming up with exactly the same ideas at the same time, like there was some sort of cultural zeitgeist that we had all tapped into. And so we were calling it Eco Town, and we came up with the name, the Dancing Rabbit Project, which is sort of a long story. But our first public presentation was in 1993 at Earth Day, and we got together there. We did a presentation, and then after that we started having regular potlucks and monthly meetings, and had an email list when that was sort of a new thing that people had at the time. And so we came together as a group during those years, and then it was in 95 that some of us decided that to really make it happen, we really had to start living together again. By that point, we had graduated. We had also attracted people who weren't part of the Stanford community, and so we actually moved in together in a place in Berkeley, California, and we lived there for about a year, and then we started having meetings as often as 4 to 5 times a week, and so that really accelerated the process. And at that point, we were working on clarifying our vision, working on our membership structure, doing a lot of planning, looking for land, figuring out what were the priorities for buying land. And it was in 96 that we left California. We had decided that we weren't going to be able to find affordable land in California that didn't have restrictive zoning and building codes. So we started looking around the country, and specifically in the Midwest and the Northeast. And we wanted to be near an existing community, and we had visited Sand Hill Farm in our many trips to communities to try and learn from what was already out there, and we decided to move to Scotland County because it met all of our criteria. Well, one of our first steps was to look around at other communities, because we figured if there was something out there that we could join, we wanted to do that. And that's something I recommend to anyone who talks about forming a community, because it's a lot of work. And so we definitely, if you can find one out there that meets your needs, definitely join before starting one. So we visited Twin Oaks in Virginia, which has a lot of similar values, and we adopted from a lot of different values from there. We really like some of the land use planning that they did, and how some of their buildings are clustered. They do a lot of ecological stuff. They grow a lot of their food. They have industry and business on site. But we decided against a fully income-sharing model from very early on, and the reason for that was we didn't think that we could grow to the size that we wanted to if we were purely income-sharing. As far as we could tell in this country, at least, there had been no groups that had grown to over 100 people with the income-sharing model, aside from the farm, which sort of had a boom and bust in the 70s and 80s. And so we thought that we would be more attractive to a wider swath of people and more accessible to the mainstream if we accepted a economic model that was more diverse and allowed for people to have their private homes, their private finances, and things like that. So a lot of inspiration from places like Twin Oaks and Eastwind, but we didn't think that income sharing was the model for Dancing Rabbit. We visited co-housing type communities, and we looked at, like, do we want to be in an urban area, do we want to be suburban, and our goal was to sort of push the envelope, to be more radical, to really look at fundamental changes, not just incremental changes. And so we really ended up looking more towards rural areas where we could do those different things that we wouldn't have been able to do if there were restrictive zoning and building codes. We certainly weren't looking for any sort of specific spiritual model because, again, we wanted diversity. We figured that if we were creating radical change on the ecological front, that we wanted to not be pushing agendas on the economic, spiritual, religious fronts, because we wanted to allow for the most possible diversity. We already figured we were going to be limiting our pool of people when you're talking about no private ownership of vehicles and alternative energy and things like that. And in a rural area, there's only going to be so many people that you're going to be drawing from. We learned a lot about food production from different people, from different communities. We learned a lot about how to get along and consensus decision making, how to structure the community to, as far as like membership structures and dues, and just a lot about the social glue that really makes community work. And I would say that Dancing Rabbit wouldn't still be here today if it wasn't for how much we learned from the community's movement, and especially the communities that have been around for 20, 30 years. We were able to stand on the shoulders of all the work that they had done. Sure. We learned very early on from other communities that one key thing was to have very clear ownership of the land in something that the whole group could control. It's very common that a community might start with one person or a couple or a family or a small group owning the land, and they try to avoid the power dynamics inherent in that, but it's really challenging to do it. There have been groups that have successfully made the transition to real group control over the land, but we wanted to start from the very beginning. And so from the start, we set up a nonprofit land trust to own the land so that everyone had control over that, to minimize how much the founders or the people who had the funding, to minimize how much extra power they have. They're still going to have some power in the group, but to really address that from the get-go. And so that was something we did clearly from the beginning. We also learned from other groups about just being really clear about membership and what it means to be a member in the group. And so from very early on, we tried to clarify, you have to have come to this many meetings, or you have to have lived here for this long before you can become a member. You have to be consented upon by the existing membership, and then sort of what the rights and responsibilities of members were. So we've had a membership agreement before we had any other bylaws or any other agreements. Really, it was one of the first things we wrote up our vision statement and our membership agreement from the very beginning. And that's really served us. I think that sometimes groups struggle with, there's the question of like, who even gets to make this decision, especially in the very early stages when and we experienced this to some extent, where it's like we had this potluck and this mailing list, and people would walk in the door, and maybe on their first or second meeting would be like, well, I think Dancing Rabbit should be this. And it was just sort of like, well, that's an interesting idea, but that's not really what direction we're going, because they wanted to do something urban, or they wanted to do a summer camp for kids, and it was like, great ideas, go for it, but it wasn't what we were doing. And so luckily we had enough clarity of process and clarity of vision that we were able to keep it focused on a specific path.